My name is Hannah, and I was 34 years old when my husband gave me an ultimatum that changed my life forever. We had been married for 6 years and shared a wonderful 3-year-old son named Oliver. On the surface, our marriage looked stable. Mark worked hard, loved our son, and always provided for our family. But there was one problem that slowly poisoned our relationship: his family. Whenever his parents or sister were around, Mark stopped being my partner and became their loyal defender. His mother criticized everything I did, from the way I cooked to how I raised Oliver, while his sister, Rachel, never missed an opportunity to make sarcastic remarks at my expense. Every time I tried to explain how hurtful it was, Mark dismissed my feelings with the same sentence: "That's just how they are." I spent years swallowing my pride to keep the peace, convincing myself that staying silent was the best thing for my family. But every insult chipped away at my confidence. The breaking point came during a large family barbecue hosted by Mark's parents. The backyard was filled with relatives, laughter, and children playing. Oliver was sitting beside me eating fresh fruit when my mother-in-law walked over, looked at his plate, and frowned. She mocked me for limiting his sugar intake, even though our pediatrician had recommended it. I politely explained that I was following medical advice, but Rachel immediately joined in, joking that I read one parenting article and suddenly thought I knew everything. Several relatives laughed, and I felt the familiar sting of humiliation. Normally, I would have ignored it, but this time Oliver was listening. I calmly replied that following a doctor's advice wasn't something anyone should ridicule. The atmosphere changed instantly. My mother-in-law accused me of being disrespectful. Rachel insisted I always created drama, and one by one, the rest of the family began piling on. I looked at Mark, silently begging him to say something, anything, to stop it. Instead, he sat there in complete silence while I stood alone against his entire family. After years of holding everything inside, I finally admitted how exhausted I was from constantly being criticized and treated like an outsider. I didn't yell or insult anyone. I simply told the truth. That truth was apparently too much for them. The entire family turned against me, and finally Mark stood up with anger written across his face. In front of everyone, he pointed toward the door and said, "Apologize right now, or get out." The backyard fell completely silent. Every pair of eyes waited for me to surrender, like I always had before. Instead, I calmly stood up, walked inside, gathered Oliver's things, carried my sleeping son to the car, and drove away without saying another word. That night, after putting Oliver to bed, I sat alone in my kitchen replaying the entire day. Then I realized something terrifying. The problem wasn't one argument, it was 6 years of being expected to tolerate disrespect, just to keep everyone else comfortable. Around midnight, I remembered an old friend named Sophia who had once offered me a job overseas. 3 years earlier, I had turned it down because I believed my family came first. This time, I picked up my phone and sent her a message. Within an hour, she replied. The opportunity was still there, and my decision would change everything. Sophia's message felt like a door opening. After years of living in a room with no windows, over the next few days, we spoke several times, and she explained that her company in New Zealand had expanded and urgently needed someone with my experience. I completed interviews, reviewed the offer, and accepted the position. Then I quietly began preparing for a completely different future. I researched neighborhoods, arranged housing, enrolled Oliver in a preschool near our new apartment, organized legal paperwork, transferred savings, and carefully planned every step to make sure my son would have a stable life. Every decision came down to one question: would this give Oliver a healthier environment? If the answer was yes, I kept moving forward. While I was rebuilding my future in silence, Mark behaved exactly as I expected. He assumed I would eventually apologize. At first, he barely mentioned the argument. Then he started sending casual messages asking if I was ready to move on. His mother called repeatedly. Rachel texted about family unity, and several relatives reached out insisting everyone should make peace. None of them apologized for how I had been treated. None of them asked how I was feeling. They simply expected me to restore everyone's comfort by pretending nothing had happened. Instead of arguing, I stopped explaining myself altogether. My silence frustrated them more than any debate ever could because they had nothing left to twist against me. 3 weeks later, everything was ready. My new job was confirmed, the apartment was waiting, Oliver's school had accepted him, and 2 airline tickets sat safely in my email. The night before we were scheduled to leave, Mark came home carrying takeout from my favorite restaurant. convinced it would smooth everything over like it always had. We sat quietly while Oliver slept upstairs. I think we've dragged this out long enough, he said with a confident smile. I looked at him and agreed. Relief spread across his face as he assumed I was finally giving in. I knew you'd come around, he said. I almost felt sorry for him because he had no idea that while he believed our argument was ending, an entirely new chapter of my life was about to begin. The following morning, after Mark left for work, I packed the last suitcase, buckled Oliver into his car seat, and drove toward the airport. Before leaving, I placed a single letter on the kitchen counter explaining why I was leaving, why I refused to raise our son believing that disrespect should be tolerated, and why I could no longer sacrifice my self-respect to protect everyone else's feelings. My phone began ringing nonstop before I even reached my gate. Calls, messages, and desperate voicemails poured in the moment Mark found my letter. I ignored them until our plane was all ready, high above the clouds, and Oliver was peacefully asleep beside me. When I finally answered, Mark's voice was filled with panic. "You're actually doing this?" he asked in disbelief. I looked out the airplane window before answering calmly. "Yes." He called me reckless and insisted I was destroying our family. But I quietly replied, "What's destroying? This family is expecting me to spend the next 20 years apologizing every time someone disrespects me." For the first time since we had met, Mark had no response. Life in New Zealand wasn't easy at first. Starting over meant adapting to a new country, a new job, and a completely different routine. But slowly, everything changed. Oliver became happier, more confident, and far more relaxed without constant family tension surrounding him. I found peace I hadn't felt in years and finally realized how much emotional energy I had spent trying to earn acceptance from people who had already decided I would never be enough. The distance also forced Mark to confront the truth. Without his family's constant influence, he finally saw the unhealthy dynamics that had existed for years. He realized how often he had chosen keeping his mother and sister happy instead of protecting his own wife. Months later, he apologized, not for a single argument, but for every time he had ignored my feelings, dismissed my concerns, and allowed me to stand alone. Eventually, his mother and Rachel apologized as well, though only after realizing they no longer had control over the situation. Rebuilding trust wasn't immediate, but genuine boundaries were finally established. And for the first time, our relationship became healthier because respect had become non-negotiable. Looking back now, I understand that the plane ticket itself never changed my life. What changed everything was realizing I had a choice. The night my husband told me to apologize or leave, he believed he was punishing me. He never imagined I would choose to walk away. But that single decision taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Respect is never something you beg for. It is something you demand through your actions. The moment I chose myself and my son, everything else finally began to fall into place. The first few weeks in New Zealand tested me in ways I hadn't expected. Every morning I woke up before sunrise, packed Oliver's lunch, learned unfamiliar roads, and tried to build a routine from nothing. There were moments when the loneliness hit hard. I had no nearby relatives, no old friends except Sophia, and no familiar places that felt like home. At night, after putting Oliver to bed, I sometimes questioned whether I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Then I would watch my son sleeping peacefully without fear, without tension, and without hearing adults argue around him. Those moments reminded me exactly why I had left. Sophia became more than a friend. She became the support system I desperately needed. She introduced me to coworkers, helped me understand local schools, and reminded me that starting over always feels impossible until one day it simply becomes normal. Within a month, I was earning my own salary, decorating our small apartment, and slowly creating a home that belonged only to us. Meanwhile, Mark continued calling almost every day. At first, his messages were filled with anger. He accused me of taking Oliver away from him, demanded that I return immediately, and insisted we could solve everything if I simply came back. I listened quietly but refused to argue. Eventually, the anger faded. His calls became shorter and quieter. Instead of making demands, he started asking questions about Oliver. What was he learning? Had he made friends? Was he happy? I answered every question honestly because despite everything, I never wanted to stand between my son and his father. But I also made one thing clear. If Mark wanted to rebuild our family, he first had to rebuild my trust. Several months passed before Mark asked if he could visit us. I agreed, but only under clear conditions. He would stay in a hotel, We would meet in public places, and every conversation would remain respectful. To my surprise, he accepted without arguing. When he arrived, I barely recognized him. The confidence he once carried had been replaced with quiet reflection. During our first conversation, he admitted something I never expected to hear. After I left, family gatherings had changed completely, without me there to blame. His mother and Rachel had started criticizing other relatives. Arguments broke out over small issues. And for the first time, Mark realized I had never been the problem. I had simply been the easiest target. He confessed that several cousins had privately admitted they always knew. I was treated unfairly, but were too afraid to speak up. Hearing that hurt more than I expected. For years, I had wondered if I was imagining everything, yet so many people had quietly watched it happen. Mark apologized again, this time with specific examples. He remembered birthdays when his mother embarrassed me, holidays when Rachel mocked my parenting, and countless occasions when he had stayed silent because confronting them felt uncomfortable. I failed you, he said quietly. Not once, over and over again. Those words meant more than any dramatic speech because they showed he finally understood what I had been, carrying alone. I didn't forgive him immediately. Instead, I told him, forgiveness wasn't a single conversation, it was a pattern of consistent actions. If he truly wanted another chance, he would have to prove that our family came before everyone else. Part 6, final. The next year became a slow process of rebuilding rather than pretending nothing had happened. Mark attended counseling on his own and later invited me to join virtual sessions. He learned how deeply people-pleasing had controlled his decisions and how often he confused keeping the peace with doing the right thing. More importantly, he finally established boundaries with his family. When his mother criticized me during a phone call, he ended the conversation. When Rachel made sarcastic remarks, he refused to laugh along. For the first time since we had married, he acted like a husband before acting like a son or a brother. Watching those changes didn't erase the past, but it showed me that people can change when they truly accept responsibility. Eventually, Mark relocated to New Zealand so he could be close to Oliver. We chose not to rush back into living together. Instead, we rebuilt our relationship one honest conversation at a time. Trust returned slowly because it had been broken slowly. Today, our marriage looks very different from the one we started with. There are boundaries, mutual respect, and one simple rule neither of us will ever ignore again. No one, not even family, gets to disrespect our home. Sometimes people ask whether leaving saved my marriage. The truth is more complicated. Leaving saved me first, and only after I found the courage to value myself did our marriage have any chance of surviving. Looking back, I no longer remember the barbecue as the day my husband humiliated me. I remember it as the day I stopped accepting less than I deserved. The ultimatum that was meant to break me became the opportunity that rebuilt my entire life. Sometimes the bravest decision isn't staying and hoping people will change. Sometimes it's walking away, trusting yourself, and allowing life to prove that choosing self-respect is never the wrong decision.